What's up, and welcome into the DePaul Hoops podcast with the great Andy Thompson. I am Nick Palazzolo, a part of the Big East Energy Network. As Andy is fresh off the plane, probably literally from Destin, Florida, as DePaul went 1-1 this past weekend at the Emerald Coast Classic. A good win against Georgia Tech, a bad loss against LSU. We'll get into it and a lot more. All of that and more is next on the DePod.
Look to his shot. Spins, fade away. Yes, sir. Chandler hits the three.
Oh, tough shot. Giving it up to Reed.
Well, Andy, you leave the great state of Illinois to go to Florida for the weekend, and then you come back to up to a foot of snow. First of all, how was the trip to Destin?
Yeah, it was a good time. It was cool to see basketball at that high of a level. Mostly being played in a Division II gym. I thought Northwest Florida State did a great job of hosting, and it was fun to be out there. Got to have some conversations with the great Dave Corzine as he was as we were getting ready for some of the games, and told me he's going to be following along with the show, so that'll be pretty cool. But I mean, it was a good time. I think the team definitely learned some things. I would say more so on Saturday, and we'll kind of touch on that later. But I do think the Georgia Tech game was also kind of a great springboard for, even if Georgia Tech, maybe isn't the best Power 5 opponent, that we'll see all year. I think a defense like that was a good test for DePaul to kind of get a benchmark of, okay, here's where we're at. And hopefully some of the things from that game can kind of be carried forward into some of these early Big East games. But yeah, it was a good time. Looking forward to getting out to maybe a couple more road games here throughout the year. And yeah, I mean, floor is yours, whatever we want to talk about.
Yeah, so DePaul takes down Georgia Tech 75-61 in a game at halftime where DePaul was down a touchdown. They were down 7, and then they rattle off, 50 points in the second half. They outscore Georgia Tech 50-29 in the second half. So, that is kind of the tale of the game, really the tale of two halves. Blocker and Maclin lead the way with 18 and 16 respectively. But Andy, I think it was just really impressive just because we've seen, a slow start to a half, not out of the jump or the second half, really hurt this team down the stretch. But it was good to see, at least Friday night, that they were just able to kind of put their foot on the gas and really take off. And that's something we want to see more of. Again, did they play a full, 40 minutes of basketball where everything was going right? No, but it was close. And I think it was again, it's a good win. It was a game you probably should have won. And you win that game by 14.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what I'll say is I like the intensity that came out of the half with, because, you go into half, obviously it's 32-25 in favor of the Yellow Jackets, who DePaul had not played since the 1989, I believe, NCAA tournament. Correct me if I'm wrong there. It had been a while since we played them. It was good to see him come out with some intensity against a defense that, heading into the game was ranked inside the top 20 on KenPom. And I like the aggressiveness they came out with, especially around the rim. DePaul in this game shot 20 of 34 from 2-point range, which obviously is a very good percentage there, especially after, like we touched on there, 5 of 16 from 2-point range at the half against Detroit Mercy. They came out with much more intensity around the rim. And I liked the way that, guys like Layden, Blocker, and Maclin, who each had 14 points in the second half of their 16 and 18, and they had over half the team scoring in the second half. I think we found out that, to an extent, this team is going to go as the play of Layden and Brandon can take us. And unfortunately, might be without Brandon for a while. We can touch on that later. But I was impressed with just the intensity on offense and the consistency that they were playing with. The ball wasn't getting bogged down. It was moving around, and guys were looking for each other. This was another game where you had a high assist rate. You had 12 assists on 27 made 12 assists on 27 made field goals. So not quite as high as the second in the nation rate we've been used to on KenPom at 71%, but the ball's still moving. Guys are getting open shots, and you shot just well enough from three that you were able to, ultimately run away with it when Georgia Tech kind of got, flustered because of DePaul's own defense late in the second half.
Yeah, and I think Holtman mentioned it to you and the other media members that were there post-game after the Georgia Tech win. Again, it was a good win, but it was also like a discovery win in a way, because Holtman had this idea about, that game against Georgia Tech being what, you can, put as much stock into the Georgia Tech game as you want to, or Georgia Tech is an opponent, still a Power 5 opponent. But again, this was for this DePaul team to, I think Holtman's quote was, they learn they can do it, and learn to do what? Play with a higher level of physicality and just that intensity that you mentioned. I think that's really, really beneficial going forward, because you have, you got, call it what it is, 2 cupcakes coming up, and then the season gets real. There are no more cupcakes left on that schedule for the Blue Demons. And, we can talk about Maclin in a little bit. He hurt his right shoulder in the LSU game. But I think the frustrating part for probably the coaching staff, fans and alums alike, and people who follow DePaul basketball, is this team has been inconsistent with the intensity. They play with stretches that is like, this is really good. This is a team can really be a frisky team in the Big East. You're not going to win the Big East, but you could be a frisky team and play spoiler. But then there's other moments where, and I think some of us got this feeling on Saturday against LSU, there's the other moments where it's like, what are we even doing on the same floor as a team like LSU? And I think just trying to find a more consistent middle ground, because we've really, I mean, DePaul's 5-3, so they've played 8 games. We've seen probably the ends of both sides of the spectrum. And we just DePaul just needs to get to a place where it's more consistent. They learn that they can, but then the next day you kind of have a letdown effort.
Yeah, for sure. Like you said, you've kind of seen both ends of the energy spectrum. And, talking about how the offense is moving in this game, the point in the game where I decided that, okay, I think DePaul is going to be able to pull away with this. Obviously, there's no lead is safe, and you're not certain how long someone is going to last in terms of that. But I did think the moment that I was convinced DePaul was going to pull away in the Georgia Tech game, and we can contrast this with LSU now, is when Layden Blocker early in the second half gets up for that dunk, and there was a foul that my photos showed that wasn't called, but I think both teams got a call or two, so it doesn't really.
I was going to say, which one?
In the grand scheme, doesn't matter too much, because obviously DePaul was able to pull away with a large enough win. But despite Layden's arm being visibly held in my photos during that dunk, I just thought that coming out with that level of intensity right out of the half was exactly what DePaul needed, and I think it kind of jolted the team awake when he did that. And to contrast that, I wasn't convinced that it was going to be great offensive performance against LSU pretty much, after the first 10 or so minutes, because I just didn't see, Holtman has talked about simplifying the offense for his team and just making sure the ball isn't stagnating. And I think a way I look at it, in a simple way as well, is the team against Detroit Mercy and against Georgia Tech being Layden's dunk. There was a play that kind of, I don't want to call it an energy play, but you know what I'm trying to say, where there was a play that woke up the rest of the team, and they were able to feed off the energy of that, and then they were able to kind of match that intensity. And I just, Brandon being out didn't help that for most of the second half, but I just never saw any individual offensive moment in the LSU game that really was like, okay, we're going to take over this game. We're going to come out with like a higher level of intensity. I just didn't see that. And to kind of contrast that with the second half against Georgia Tech, not even 24 hours before, it was, like you said, it was kind of both ends of a spectrum for like a DePaul that comes out with energy can beat just about anybody in the Big East, home or on the road. But the level of energy we saw against LSU, and I would say Buffalo as well, that team is going to finish lower than they were even picked in the in the coaches poll, probably 11th in the Big East. If that team plays all 20 games in the Big East against LSU, in a league where Butler and Seton Hall are honestly two of the team's most valuable teams right now, where they were picked 10th and 11th, and now they're four of the teams that are top 50 in the net, DePaul is not going to be able to finish as high as we were hoping this year if the team that played LSU plays all 20 games in the Big East.
Well, and I think just to compare this year's team with last year's team, and I'm not saying it's a apples to apples comparison, but last year's team, you knew you were getting that competitive fight, that intensity from the jump. Just they just kind of fell apart. Like they could only take it so far, and then about the beginning of the second half, midway through the second half, you could just see running on fumes type of thing. This year, you see it for different intermittent stretches. Like it's just very different. You can play 8 minutes of great basketball, 12 minutes of not so great basketball, and then come with 4 and then 6 and then at about 3. Like there's just a lot of ups and downs, and the ebbs and the flows of the season are going to happen, but it's all just trying to stay within yourself and not trying to play hero ball. And I think that it was interesting. Whatever the last home game was. What was the last home game? Was it Gardner
Mercy.
Webb or
Mercy.
It was Mercy, but I think I'm
Man, I
talking
thought I
about
was losing.
Gardner Webb. Yes. I think RJ. It was after Gardner Webb because I wasn't at Mercy, but after Gardner Webb, RJ Smith said something about wanting to play for each other and like just learning to I don't remember his exact quote, but it was about like a team building and a team bonding, like that has to translate onto the court. And I found that interesting because as we kind of get into it, there were certainly some situations over this past weekend in Destin where it's like there was some hero ball being played. Because especially when you just give up a 7-8, a 12-0 run, right? Like there are times that you just want to be the guy to hit the 3, to shoot them out of it, right? To kind of end that run. But again, the other side of that momentum pendulum is if you miss, why you just shifted a little bit more momentum towards the other side. And I think this team they need to find consistency, but they're sharing the ball really well and is still top 10 in the country in terms of assist rate. This weekend, again, not a great case to help that overall. There was a time, I think, during the Georgia Tech game where they were first in the country, and now they fell to, I believe they're like 8th or 9th now. But you just got to find a way to stay within yourself and not trying to do too much. Because at times, especially when the intensity and stuff isn't there, I feel like some of the guys are trying to do a little bit too much, if that makes sense.
No, I 100% agree. And I think, honestly, where I saw, I don't want to say disconnectedness, but I think the place that I was most shocked by was on the defensive end of the floor and the rebounding for this team. If you don't want to count a dead ball rebound, it took us, because obviously dead balls, those can go either way. It's less about like, okay, getting up for a board.
Right.
DePaul was being out rebounded 9-0 against LSU until the 10:22 mark of the first half, where NJ Benson grabbed his first defensive rebound of the night. I believe he'd finish with 4 rebounds himself, which is tied for a team high. LSU worked DePaul on the glass 37-19, and LSU grabbing 37 rebounds, which include 8 offensive and 29 defensive, also come as they were able to shoot 30 of 38 from 2-point range. So they were almost doubling us up in the rebounding category with making over 70% of our 2-pointers. And I don't think, as jarring as that sounds, I don't even think DePaul's 2-point defense was necessarily that bad. We just came out with very little offensive rhythm throughout the game, and it kind of showed, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think with LSU, like, again, LSU had 54 points in the paint. DePaul had 63 points total. I think that just tells you everything you need to know about the game. We can leave the 45 fouls for what it is. Because, I mean, when you get to the halftime or beginning of the second half and you got, 5 guys with at least 2, someone with 3, again, that doesn't help. Again, you got to go a little bit deeper into your bench, but also to an extent, like, again, that's where I, you know, talk about that hero ball, right? Again, were there some ticky-tacky calls? I mean, and Holtman said it to you post-game, I think. Again, that was the most physical game they've played all season. But again, that LSU team is closer to what you will see in the Big East than any other game that DePaul has played in the other 7. So I think it's really important to losing to LSU sucks, and I think LSU is really good. I think their composite between all of the rankings is about 23rd in the country. And, you know, but the rest of the Big East is closer to LSU than they are, you know, a Northwestern or a Gardner Webb or a Buffalo, right? Like, LSU is going to be the team where we kind of look at as who DePaul plays in the early going that could help them. Again, and I hope this game, you know, this upcoming weekend at hosting Arkansas Pine Bluff, you know, DePaul comes out firing. I think the week off will really be beneficial.
Yes.
But I also think that, you know, this was also a reality check. Again, if you don't do the little things like communicating on defense and, you know, play team basketball, the LSU game isn't going to become an outlier. It's going to become the theme. And that's the thing you don't want to happen.
100%. I think, you know, like you said, we can talk all we want about obviously DePaul just having an off night offensively where they only shot, you know, 22 of 52. LSU took one last shot, was 35 of 51. But I do kind of want to just touch on what you mentioned there, where it's, you know, the composite ranking for LSU, you know, as much as obviously that may not be something that, you know, DePaul fans who have been around for, you know, the last 20 years want to admit, because I'll be the first to say, like, I wasn't even 3 years old the last time DePaul made a tournament. And I'm not even, you know, and you're younger than me by a little bit. So yeah. I don't want to be sitting here and saying like, okay, in the past 21 years, like, you know, it happening to DePaul as much as it has is normal. But I just kind of want to use last week's Players Era Festival alone to kind of illustrate, okay, this is what's been happening to teams. You know, Michigan beat San Diego State. They were in a title game 2 years ago. Michigan beat San Diego State by 40. You had Iowa State beat Creighton by almost 20. You had Michigan beat Auburn by 30. You had Gonzaga beat Maryland, who has a road win at Marquette this year, by 40. You had Alabama beat UNLV by 40. You had Iowa State beat unranked Syracuse by 30. And you had Michigan, of course, beat Gonzaga by 40, which was, I think, the most baffling game I've ever watched. And, oh, by the way, Alabama the same night beat Maryland by 30. So obviously that's extreme cases, but you know, blowouts like this, you know, for what it's worth, occasionally do happen. And to their credit, LSU in a Trilly Donovan composite rank that includes the net and the AP poll and KenPom and everything else, LSU is 24th in the country. They're currently 19th in the net, 23rd in KenPom, with a 7-0 record that obviously DePaul is the quote-unquote toughest game they played. But they've got Texas Tech coming up. You know, they've got some real Power 5 schools that have, you know, been far in NCAA tournament the past few years before they get to SEC play, which is always going to be a buzzsaw. So obviously it doesn't help that, you know, DePaul suffered what you would call like another one of the blowouts that, you know, some of the longtime DePaul fans are used to seeing. But there's a side to it where it's like we could have just run into a 6 or a 7 seed and just had an off night after a Georgia Tech game that, you know, that was the first time DePaul had beaten a high major opponent in MTE since November of 2011. When a tournament called the Old Spice Classic that no longer exists, you know, DePaul beat Arizona State 14 years ago, last time you beat a high major in an MTE. And it was also the first time in 3 years you beat a high major not coached by one Mr. Kenny Payne. You hadn't beaten a high major in a non-con since November 2022, a road victory over Minnesota. So the Georgia Tech game was, you know, something that DePaul I think needed kind of as a proof of concept, like you said, like to prove like, hey, we can do this. But then also to kind of say, okay, you come away from Destin having learned if we play connected, this is what the game is going to look like. If we come out a bit flat and the ball isn't moving as much and the offense isn't flowing as much and we're not being aggressive around the rim, it's going to look like LSU for all 20 games. And I think that's kind of a good way for the team to look at it, where now they have a week off to process the film, kind of learn from it. And then you've got Arkansas, Pine Bluff, and Morgan State to get the last little, you know, kinks out of the offense, hopefully. and then you're at Wichita State, and then before you know it, you're seeing Rick Pitino, you're seeing Dan Hurley, and you're seeing Kevin Willard all before the new year. So, like you said, the time for Cupcake is almost over. Big East play is getting here, but, you kind of got an idea of what both versions of DePaul look like just in this little 2-day window here, and I think that was, even if the LSU margin of loss was higher than you and I and the staff and all the fans would have wanted, I think that's ultimately, it can be a learning experience if the team wants it to be, or it can kind of just be an idea of how the season goes depending on, what happens over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I think just kind of parlaying that into just kind of the net rankings, because again, DePaul checks in at 183rd in the net rankings, the worst Big East team. There's, I believe, 4 teams in the top 50, 5 in the top 75. Everybody else is outside the top 100, Xavier being the closest to the top 100 at 102. But again, everybody wants to be mad and, kind of bash DePaul. But again, I think according to the net rating, like, this is what they are. Like, this is what inconsistent play gets you. And I think that's just the reality of the situation. But what's a little bit more confounding to me is just the strength of schedule. Because again, it's not like DePaul is playing this gauntlet of a non-conference schedule. And when you look at, the schools that they've played, Chicago State, Stonehill, Gardner-Webb, Detroit Mercy, Pine Bluff, Morgan State, those are all teams that are, ranked 319 or worse out of 365 teams, according to KenPom. Then you have your Buffaloes climbing, Northwestern, you have LSU, you had Georgia Tech, right? You got a Wichita State coming up. Like, you just need to find a way to get more consistent. That Wichita State game is really, really interesting to me, and I know we'll get to that in a couple weeks. But when you look at the metrics for DePaul, again, 183 is not the most flattering rating or ranking in the world, but it is what it is. And I think that, again, the Big East as a conference has kind of struggled in the early going. Again, DePaul's been consistent. I think the Big East Conference as a whole has been inconsistent with their wins and losses. Had some good wins, but also some really bad losses. And I think that, just when you look at it in totality, like, before DePaul and, can start talking about the other teams, like, fix what's in your own house first. And I think that's kind of where DePaul is at. I think year 3 has always been the goal for Chris Holtman. But I think that, this is also kind of a reminder of, success doesn't happen overnight as much as we all want it to.
No, for sure. And I think you bring up an interesting point there about, kind of where DePaul's net's at. Well, I'll kind of recap for you what DePaul's done so far. You lose to Buffalo, who, let's hope not that DePaul is necessarily, and you and I both know DePaul isn't really going to threaten for the tournament this year necessarily, but, sure. Buffalo is a Q3 loss right now, for what it's worth. Wichita State is currently 104th in the net. So, you want to talk about the league metrics. Obviously, DePaul can only help out the league so much compared to the whole that it and some other teams like Marquette, which I cannot believe is even remotely in our area code, but they're 167 right now. And we have a better win if you look at KenPom ratings than they do over Georgia Tech, which is baffling considering they were a top 10 team this time. Well, top 10 team this time last year. But,
sure.
I think that, you only beat Stonehill by 8. Right? Detroit Mercy, that could have been a 30, 40-point win, which, the net likes. And it was only a 20-point win. Obviously, Chicago State, that was a good game, but that was early, and that's only not going to do so much for you. Northwestern, close loss. Northwestern's around 50 or so in net, I believe, for the Big Ten. So that would have been a good one to have for your metrics there. Georgia Tech is also a Q4 victory as a result of, Maryland Eastern Shore taking them to overtime and Georgia Southern and Louisiana Southern and West Georgia all playing them close. DePaul being on the wrong side of a blowout to LSU isn't going to help you. But these next 2 games against Pine Bluff and against Morgan State, if you can run the score up a good bit, and if you can win at Wichita, which I believe as the network rankings work, it might be a Q2 road win if you beat Wichita State. I'd have to look it up, but I believe that's correct.
I think a lot has to. I think there's some. I think Q2 road win is probably where it ends up. I don't know if it'll be like that today, but I think that's probably where it ends up.
For sure. And so I think obviously, it's silly to say must win because from like a metrics perspective, like DePaul realistically probably was not going to be a tournament team this year. They're almost certainly not going to be now because the league record you'd need to get out of the Big East is not large without, winning it out of the conference tournament would have been, obviously quite significant anyway. But now with where the league is at, where you've got more teams outside of a top 100 than in the top 50, obviously it's going to be an uphill climb for the league as a whole. But if you want to talk about just for DePaul's own metrics and kind of helping the league out as much as they can at this point with the 3 losses they have and, the Stonehill and other games being closer than you want, Wichita State is going to be very useful for the league and for DePaul. Just pick up a good, solid road win over a team that has some recent history, has a tough venue to play in. Like you said, we'll break that game down in the next couple episodes here as we get closer to it. But I think that's going to be kind of the last good barometer of, okay, where is this DePaul team at? Because now you've played away from home. You've got a good win against Georgia Tech, which is a neutral site game. But I'll be honest, the Georgia Tech crowd, for as many DePaul fans as there were that came out, and I was impressed by that. Georgia Tech is obviously significantly closer than DePaul is to Florida. And I would say, just given the volume of people in the stands, for as loud as DePaul was, that was not a neutral site game for DePaul, nor was it for LSU. So I think you've kind of seen a pseudo road environment. Now to play a true road environment, I think is going to be valuable for this team. And if they can come out on top there, you're probably looking to net that, depending on the margin of victory, gets you up to around 150 by the time all is said and done, which given where they're at right now, you can't really ask for much more.
Yeah, and one thing I do want to touch on quickly, kind of going back to Destin, is Brandon Maclin's injury. Like I said, we've kind of hinted at it a couple times, but I think now's a good time to really talk about it. I think this week off is very beneficial for DePaul because, again, I think, there's some guys who are just banged up right now. Again, you've played 8 games. The first month of the season is over. You're going to have some bumps and bruises, so a week off is always just, and another opportunity to get healthy. But with Brandon Maclin, he played 7 minutes, I think it was, in the LSU game, and he was in some pain. And I think with Maclin, he wants to come back in. And if Brandon Maclin, the guy who is the highest energy, the most vocal leader, who will just, I don't know him like that well, like I've covered him, but like he will try and play through anything. Like that's just kind of the gritty player that he is. For him to not come back in that game was telling. So I think 2 things. Him not going back in that game against LSU, again, it was out of reach, but at the same time, who knows what could have happened if Maclin's on the floor. But the second thing, as soon as he comes off the floor, the training staff puts an ice pack on his shoulder right away. It's usually not a good sign. Again, I'm not a doctor. I don't play one on TV. But he probably dislocated his shoulder. Again, you don't need to be, a physical therapist or an orthopedic surgeon to really figure that out. Again, because why would he have a big-ass ice pack over his shoulder? Because he probably dislocated it, and there's a lot of swelling and some inflammation. But I also think it's interesting, just to kind of wrap up the Maclin thing, and then you can chime in, Andy. But it's interesting because this is something he could play through, but it's also interesting because it is on his shooting shoulder, I believe, because he is right-handed, right? Like I'm not making that up.
So. I believe so.
Yes. So it's something that he will be able to potentially play through with a harness. But again, you dislocate your shoulder, you instantly have a torn labrum because the reason it dislocates is because your labrum's torn. Again, none of this is confirmed. No, nobody's telling us this. It's just one of those things where it's like, again, it's just what all the pieces kind of tell you. You hope it's not. But again, it's one of those situations where it's like he probably dislocated his shoulder. I don't think it takes a rocket scientist to figure that out.
No, and I'll just add real quick, like while I was there, at halftime, I had a team official tell me that, it was obvious, you could tell when he came out that his shoulder had popped out and they were going to have him medically examined today when he got back to Chicago. So hopefully we know more next day or two. But yeah, he wanted to come back in and they weren't going to risk it with both the game being out of reach and also, it's something with, like you said, with a week off, he'd rather not play through. I think the week off is going to be important for NJ too, where, we were kind of told that his little wrist, injury that had popped up that he was more than able to play through. Like it didn't hamper him too much, even though obviously he was only so effective in this game just because of, not being able to get a good post pass inside. But, a week off will be good for him too. After coming off the two most physical teams you've seen to this point, it'll be good to be kind of, able to take some time off. And then I assume we'll see a lot more Fabian and Teo and Kaman against Pine Bluff and Morgan State because you want to get him rested up for the gauntlet that's going to be, the last 4 games for New Year's at Wichita, at St. John's, home UConn, at Villanova. There's not going to be a tougher 4-game stretch on the schedule. So to get him and hopefully Brandon, which, we should find out about here soon, maybe even by next episode, that we come out Friday. It'll be important for those guys to get rested up. And I mean, I just think like Holtman told me after the Georgia Tech game, like, he's understanding the value of having a guy like Brandon on the team where when you're without your emotional leader and you're without the guy who's been the most vocal for you, it's going to be a lot, tougher to get yourself out of the offensive bind because he's somebody who, even if the ball isn't going in the basket for him, he brings the same level of intensity every night. And when there's nobody else on the floor who can kind of replicate that level of intensity, when you're already getting down 15, 20 points, it's not even, 5 minutes to go in the first half yet, and he's already out of the game with that injury, it's just going to be a much more uphill battle than you'd like for it to be.
Well, and the thing that's interesting about Brandon, too, is he's your second leading rebounder, like, just in totality. Like, NJ's 57 rebounds leads the team far and away. Your next is Brandon Maclin at 32, and then you have CJ Gunn at 26 total rebounds. Like, that's a big chunk to be missing from your team, let alone just the just the leadership and the just the IQ that he brings to the floor. So it'll just kind of be really interesting to see what his status is. We probably will have a better picture because I'm assuming Holtman will meet the media at some point this week before Pine Bluff on Saturday night. So that's something to watch. Andy, you got anything else you wanna say before we get on out of here?
I think we'd be remiss, for as much as we kind of had a lot to break down LSU, especially about kind of where the team, the shortcomings of a team where they can improve, up to this point. And I think Holtman, and some of the answers he gave me kind of after the Buffalo game, he just was, a lot shorter. I don't think he really had, much coherently to say about it, which is understandable because I don't think anybody, coaching staff, some of the players, I don't think anybody expected that game to go how it did. I do want to give a shout out, Layden Blocker, named the all-tournament team. He had 18, really, really strong points, and he added 6 as well. He averaged 12 points a game, 2.5 assists, shot 57% from the field. He's named the all-tournament team. And then, I would say the biggest bright spot of the LSU game, Kruz McClure, another career high, 22 points, 6 of 11 from the floor, 3 of 6 from the three-point line, 7 of 8 from the free throw line. He drew a game-high 7 fouls. So even though obviously DePaul was fouling the crap out of LSU in the first 10 minutes of the game, where the defense and intensity wasn't quite there, and you had 5 guys going to half with 2 fouls, he drew the most fouls in the game. He drew 7. Nobody on LSU drew more than 5, even though obviously quite a few of them drew 4. And I just, the thing that impressed me about Kruz, besides just his composure getting so much better over the past few weeks, is he's played his 2 best games of basketball against the 2 toughest teams we've seen. Yeah. Because even though Georgia Tech defensively was quite strong, as we touched on, their offense, and a good part of the reason why they're lower than even us in the net, they're in the 200s, is their offense in the 200s. And KenPom, they're about 250 offensively in terms of efficiency. But for him to play his 2 strongest games and come out with, 22 points against LSU, 15 points against Northwestern, for him to be playing his best basketball against the 2 toughest teams he played, that bodes really well for the early portion of his Big East schedule where, look, if Maclin's out for the next couple of games, I don't see why.
It'll be him and RJ.
I don't, it'll be him and RJ. And I honestly, I don't see why you don't take a shot at starting him against Pine Bluff or Morgan State. I think getting him that experience, with playing those big starter minutes and kind of help setting the tone for the team, that could be a lot more beneficial than even just some of the minutes he's played against LSU and Northwestern, where he's really getting, to kind of put the game a lot more in his hands early, where he'll be sharing the ball with Layden and making some of the good drives like he was able to make against LSU. I would just, for as much as obviously, some of it is in quote unquote garbage time when, you're already up, LSU's already up 30. They didn't take a lot of their starters out for most of that game. Like he wasn't doing it against back of the bench guys. He was doing it against, Markel Sutton and Dean Thomas Jr. and Robert Miller III, who, unfortunately did have a bit of a highlight play against him on the other end, but he was doing it against some LSU's strongest players. And I think that, it was just a good indication of where Kruz is at and the faith his staff has in him. I was impressed by him, and I look forward to seeing what he'll kind of have for us next few weeks.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it kind of plays out the next two games. So over the next week and a half against Pine Bluff and Morgan State. Because again, if you want him to get his feet wet, in that starting lineup, hearing his name called for the first time, being introduced for the first time, those are two soft landings. Again, it's Division I college basketball. Anything can happen. I'm not necessarily worried about the next two games, anything happening. But I think that would be as close to a soft landing as you could possibly be with the remaining Wichita State and then the Big East Gauntlet before the new year.
Yeah, for sure. I think that pretty much wraps us up. Nick, I will see you Thursday night for the Marquette women's game. We will probably have some thoughts after that game, going into the next episode. But
Big East opener, first week of December.
Yeah, Big East opener, first week of December. Gotta love the TV people and where everything's at, where they'll have, I believe, 3 more non-conference games after that. But Nick, good to see you as always. Appreciate the Big East Energy Network for having us on. We're almost a month into doing this, man. Time flies, so does the season. But Nick, look forward to seeing you Thursday. And for myself and for Nick Palazzolo, we'll see you guys later. So long, everybody.
So long.